speaker is Ed Silverstone. So Ed's a well-known face and megagame organizer. He's the designer of By the Grace of God, Gaming the Aftermath of the English Civil War. You may have interacted with him recently as plot control at all of the online megagames and helping to run MegaCon. So he's here today as our final speaker with a talk which sounds fascinating. Balancing the bandwidth economy, players as a resource. So Ed, are you all ready?
Yep. Slides are being shared, so click on the button and all that good stuff. Yeah, and away we go. So, yeah, very brief introduction. I mean, thank you, Holly, for covering it. So, for some context, I've been in the mega game space for about 5 years now, in which time I've been to about 60 games, and sort of initially quite a lot as a player, more recently quite a lot as control, been part of a couple of groups organising mega games, that kind of thing. Let's get the important question out of the way first. What makes a mega game good? First and foremost, and pretty much solely, players get to make interesting decisions. If players aren't getting to make interesting decisions, then your mega game is not good. And yeah, they may not be the worst day ever, but they will not go away with fun stories to tell, interesting anecdotes. It won't create that really visceral, satisfying experience. Interesting decisions can't just be taken in a vacuum either. They have to materially affect the outcome of the game. It has to actually matter what you decided. I'm not trying to say theme doesn't matter. A game which has a strong theme is inherently appealing and fun, and good, rich theme, well communicated, can cover a multitude of sins. But ultimately, it's the games where players make critical, difficult decisions and see the game state change as a result that they will remember and be excited about for years to come. I've used the phrase interesting decision. That's obviously very subjective, so let's tie it down a little. An interesting decision is one where there is no obvious right answer, ideally no right answer at all. So it's not just that the answer is not obvious because I haven't worked it out yet. It's that there is straight up no correct answer. It is a question that could be debated indefinitely. Why should there be no obvious right answer? Well, partly incomplete information. You're gonna inevitably have parts of the game state which are only visible to some players and not to others. Other players' decisions and plans will inevitably define what you should and shouldn't do in ways that are invisible to you. In a good mega game, you'll have multiple goals which are inherently in tension with each other. Striking out hard for one goal creates at least an opportunity cost and sometimes a political and sort of environmental cost as well, which makes other goals harder to reach. So you've always got that tension between how do we balance our competing objectives here. What I've called managing the message as well is the idea that actually it's all very well to take a big swing, but sometimes sticking your head above the parapet is a good way to make yourself a target. And any big swing likely cuts someone else out and creates enemies. So there's a question of timing, and these are the sort of imponderables which make for really interesting, really difficult, really agonizing decision making in mega games, but also mean that whether or not players make the right decision, they come away with a really great feeling about the game and about their role in it. A few things to try and avoid: if players have been actively misled, and by this I mean sort of the game has been set up with like gotchas in it, things that, oh, you would never have known this, but actually it meant that all of your planning has gone to waste. That doesn't tend to lead to interesting decisions. It just tends to leave a bad feeling in people's mouths. Similarly, if information is obscure, in other words, the information is technically there and available, but it's really hard to get at for whatever reason, then again, that's not fun. It leads to just feelings of frustration and of no agency. Again, feeling that those decisions weren't really interesting because I was never going to get the right answer. And finally, mechanical complexity. I'll make a slightly controversial statement here, which is that mechanical complexity in mega games is always bad. Anything which creates a situation where solving the puzzle of how to use the mechanics to do what I'm trying to do is harder than the negotiation and political back and forth of what are we trying to achieve is bad mega game design. Ultimately, once players know what they want to do and have come to a negotiated agreement on what they're trying to achieve, then actually getting it done, the mechanics should not get in the way of that and should not present them with an additional puzzle which obscures them from achieving their goals. So what? Well, for players to have interesting decisions to make, they have to be able to get hold of the information that's going to feed into those decisions. Where do you get information in a mega game? There are a whole ton of sources. Three rough categories. So you've got game state. In other words, look at a map. Where are my troops? Where are the opponent's troops? Where are the supply lines? All of that stuff. Player boards. So where you'll have like an economy board for each team, which may or may not be visible to other teams. Status trackers, that kind of thing. What I'm talking about generally here is any physical component in the game which is visible to players, which captures some key information about what may or may not be feasible. That's one source of information, and usually in a mega game there is quite a lot of information there. The game state is non-trivial. Secondly, possibility space. So the rule book, with the best will in the world, though, a mega game rule book is not easy to pick up and reference on the fly. So I would say in any good game there should be cheat sheets, sort of 1 page or half-page summaries, which clearly setting out the key points of, if I want to do this, how would I do it? If I want to do this, how would I do it? That players will want to reference back to, and of course player briefings as well, reminding oneself what one is actually trying to achieve. And finally, player-to-player interactions, so reports from team members and allies of the game state of negotiations they've had, all that sort of thing. And on the other side of the coin, negotiations with teams who are not necessarily enemies but not directly aligned, to give an idea of what the teams might be willing to do in exchange for what. All of that information somehow has to come together and be readily accessible to players in order for them to make meaningful and interesting decisions, in order for them to feel like they're actually got agency in the game and to get something out of it. Good grief. So my thesis is that as a designer, you genuinely is in your control to make sure that the players have that information available to them. There's a slight caveat here. Of course, there is a certain amount of chaos inherent in a mega game. Of course, people may just choose not to talk to other people, and there's only limited power you have over that. But in general, as a designer, you should accept that this is part of your responsibility as designing a game, and you should see it as a problem that you can meaningfully address. Key takeaway number one for me is it's very easy to think of the size of a role as being based on sort of the number of decisions that get made, or even the number of resources that role receives. And that can be a little misleading. That can end up actually leaving some players with very little to do and some players with a lot to do in ways that you don't expect. So, for example, the general of an army might have a lot of troops, a lot of resources, a lot of theoretical power, but in practice, the game state, the military game state, is very static, and the number of actual decisions they're making each turn might, in theory, be quite a lot. They've got a lot of troops who need to be directed, but in practice, the information that they need to make those decisions is static. It's not actually going to change over the course of the game. And it's quite easy to get hold of and grok. It's all sort of in one map. There's no other players who impact on their decision making. And so actually what you have there is a tiny role, even though objectively it seems like it's a big role. Where I'm going with this is that the size of a role really needs to be measured based on the information that role or that player needs to make the decisions that they're going to make. And then we can start to step back and say, okay, how much information gathering activity is this player going to need to do? How much time is that going to take? And that really defines how big the role is. And why are we trying to define how big a role is? Because we need to know whether it's a one-player role or two, or whether that activity needs to be split over 2, 3, 4 players, whatever. In other words, perhaps a better way to phrase it would have been how busy is a player going to be is not based on the number of resources they get, number of troops they get, is primarily based on how much information they need to make their decisions. Right, given half a chance, players will prefer to do everything badly over doing a few things well. It is very natural and human to want to be involved in every decision happening in the room, to want to be involved in every mechanic, to want to have your opinion sort of drive the direction the game is going as a whole, in every area, and not just to stay in your lane. And to an extent, that is the right way to play a mega game. Obviously, you need to make your decisions in a way that reflects the broader game state and the broader sort of policy direction people are taking. But ultimately, you also want players to be making the key decisions that you have in mind for them at a high quality, because ultimately that again will give them the most satisfying game experience, and it will give other players in the room the most satisfying game experience as well. Where possible, don't give players an option to drift around the whole room, dabbling in every single mechanical decision that's being made. Instead, try and focus them on one thing. How would you do this? Well, partly give them a clear briefing. You and your team, you are the team general. Your responsibility is moving figures on the map. You are the scientist. Your responsibility is working out research. Or maybe it's more like, you are the politician. Your responsibility is getting your team's image positively perceived by all the other teams. Not so much of a sort of specific briefing in terms of this is the mechanic that you're allowed to engage with, but still sort of very much defining the scope of that role and what they're trying to achieve. It can be tempting to think that you can just leave this up to the players, that you can sort of just set out, here's what you're trying to achieve as a team, and let the team work out who's going to do what. Unfortunately, players are quite bad at making these decisions, and what's more, these aren't particularly interesting decisions to make. This is a mildly controversial point. I'm aware that some people take a different approach, but for me, the more clarity you can give players over what they should be focusing on a given turn, what decisions are in their ballpark, and what decisions are someone else's problem, the better a game they will have, the better your game will be. In real life, a lot of time and effort does go into these meta decisions about who gets to decide what. But on the flip side, in real life, there's usually weeks and months and years to do the sort of things that in a mega game happen in a single day, and actually abstracting those decisions out, removing them from the game, and leaving the really key, interesting policy decisions for the players to grapple with, I think is just the best way to present a game for your players. A couple of key mechanics that you can use to help support this. Having an action point economy. So for those of you who haven't seen this sort of game, this is where players just get handed a certain number of action points each turn, offered a physical token, and each thing they do, they have to spend an action point to do it. If they haven't spent an action point, they just can't get involved in that bit of the game this turn. So it makes the allocation of players' attention very explicit rather than sort of a bit more wishy-washy. It forces players to focus in on areas of the game. It also enables players to focus on what they find most engaging. There are risks that you have to be aware of when doing this. There is, if some of your game mechanics are just more fun than others, more engaging, which realistically will quite often be the case, there is a risk that players will just concentrate on those, potentially breaking the wider game economy, potentially just overwhelming the bandwidth of whatever poor control player is in charge of managing that mechanic. There's also a risk of options paralysis. If you give players 2 action points a turn and there are 12 different things they could spend them on, there is a very real risk that they'll just feel utterly paralyzed by that horrible dilemma. So providing some sort of structure, some sort of guidance, some sort of way of divvying these things up, and obviously playtesting helps with this. In general, this sort of action point economy works really, really well in more narrative games, where players can just drift around the room a little more. Another very similar but not identical mechanic, what I call player worker placement, where each turn a player will just go to one area of the game, whether it's one particular map, one particular room, one particular council, whatever it might be, and they have to spend their entire turn there. means that players have a sort of tight, narrow focus in each turn. It lets the mechanics in each area be a little more nuanced because you know the players are going to be sat there the whole turn, so you could have mechanics that have a bit of back and forth between players. It does mean that players usually have to understand all the rules of the game, not just the rules of their one area, which doesn't have to be a problem. Again, that's just a challenge that it presents you with as a game designer to make sure that players realistically can hold the bulk of the rules in their head and can jump easily from one area of the game to the other. It can create blind spots if you as a team have been sending your players to these 4 areas for the whole of the game and suddenly you discover that something critical is happening in the 5th area. So you need, I think, to again be aware of that. It's not a deal breaker, but it's a design challenge that you will face if you're taking this sort of approach. In my view, this sort of structure is best for more sort of political operational games where players are doing individually quite complex things and where there will be a degree of horse trading of, okay, you go and act in our interests over there, we'll go and act in your interests over here. Both of these, and indeed, even if you're not designing a game or one of those 2 principles, any game you design, you need to understand for each action players can take in the game what decisions they're making as part of each of those actions, and critically, what information drives those decisions. You need to be able to say where that information comes from and realistically where the players are going to get that information. And also how those decisions affect each other over the game. I haven't touched on this in great depth, and I probably won't. But this is back to the point right at the beginning about decisions have to have a meaningful impact on the game state in order for players to feel like the decision was worth making, like they have agency. And this is in particular that it shouldn't just be that the impact is siloed within that sort of game area. Otherwise, what you end up with is 3 or 4 separate, unrelated games. Couple of other points: how do players choose where to spend their actions? I am increasingly of the belief that most mega games need a sort of pre-communication time, not necessarily massive long one, but a period outside of team time where players are just free to go and chat before and make deals, come up with joint plans and so forth before they're then into the mechanical resolution phase of the game. A good general rule for any game where you are giving players freedom of where they're engaging is a law of diminishing returns. In other words, the more players who get involved in an area, the less that area gives out in terms of sort of resources, prestige, results in general. And this is a good way to combat the issue I flagged earlier about overwhelming a particular mechanic if there is a sort of law of diminishing returns inherently built into aspects of your game. Finally, often wise to just include an other option. So sometimes players will need to spend a whole turn talking, and if they can sort of put their action counter somewhere that just says other, generate a few resources and let me go off and talk, then that can be really helpful for enabling the political layer of the game to keep evolving and developing, rather than players getting stuck in the mechanics and needing to focus on those to be competitive at the cost of discourse and coordination. It would be remiss not to mention the classic sort of watch the skies-esque model of game design. This doesn't really, I don't think this works for many games. The idea that you have sort of separate mini games in different corners of the room, and every turn you go to the same mini game, and that mini game is where you sort of focus all your attention. It does have the advantage that players only have to absorb their rules, but it makes it very hard to include individual goals. Like if your team's scientist also has some kind of parallel goal, then your team just doesn't get science in this game, and that kind of breaks the game for all of your players and so forth. So realistically, players will sort of have to have just team goals, which you may or may not care about. It's very hard to keep all of the mini games equally relevant to the overall flow of the game, so it's very easy for players to feel irrelevant and disenfranchised if they are sort of, for want of a better word, trapped in one quadrant of the game. And players often have a very limited view of the consequences of their actions, which again may or may not be desirable as a designer. There's an extent to which that might be realistic fog of war, but my view in general is that is an uninteresting sort of constraint on decision making. There is definitely a design space for these very sort of structured games where players have a very defined role that they focus on. But my view is that actually a lot of games would benefit from a step away from this particular model for what it's worth, towards one that is a bit more freeform, albeit that creates extra complications that a designer has to address. So, to sum up that rather rapid fire ramble, when designing a game, give players interesting decisions to make. Remembering that interesting decisions are ones where the answer is not obvious and they materially impact the state of the game. Know how players will get the information they need, and where possible in your model of how the game will flow, allocate decisions to players based on the quantity of information they will need to gather in order to make those decisions. Cool. That is everything I have to say. Any questions would be very welcome at this point.
Thank you very much, Ed. So I think we've got questions already coming in. So I don't think we're going to have any problem here. So first one's from Paddy. How should we use the inherent chaos of a mega game as a resource for information management?
Yeah, all right. I mean, I think the answer is basically you don't have any choice. The inherent chaos of a mega game is going to restrict information management. My view is that the more information players are able to gather, the more readily, the better. And therefore, it's more about finding ways to combat the inherent chaos of a mega game. You will never accidentally, well, I don't think you will ever accidentally create a mega game where the chaos has all been drained out and players are wondering where it's gone. But creating visually clear status trackers, visually clear tokens, cheat sheets, summaries, creating time windows explicitly for conversation. All of these things are good ways to mitigate the chaos in order to help players make more informed decisions, which are more meaningful in terms of affecting the game state. I hope that answers the question. I feel like I feel like that probably answers the question, but if it doesn't, feel free to rephrase it and ask it again.
So Johan, first of all, would like you to maybe tell us a bit more clearly how you feel about this topic, because I think you maybe. So his actual question.
Sacred cows, but more than happy to be challenged on that.
So what tools does Control have at their disposal when game mechanics / materials / rules have not been absorbed by players to ensure that it doesn't break the economy and or people actively try and take shortcuts through player worker placement, action points, time management economy? How would you address that?
I mean, I'll answer the second half first because I have quite strong feelings there, which is fundamentally the Control do need to push players back in their lane on occasion. The very little kills a mega game experience faster than a micromanaging team leader, and while you can to an extent resolve this mechanically by having people sort of mechanically obliged to allocate their attention in one place for the course of the turn, if the team leader insists on coming over, leaning over their players' shoulders, telling them how to play their game, Control needs to tell them initially politely and then gradually less politely to piss off, because ultimately not only are they making the game less fun for that particular player, they're making the game less fun for everyone at that table by delaying the flow of the game and by cutting the player that they're actually interacting with out of the decision-making process. What if players haven't read the rules? Well, I mean, this is a fundamental question. I think partly this is a game design problem. If you have, in the ideal world, your rules should be designed in such a way that even if a player has barely skimmed them or maybe not read them at all, you've got cheat sheets physically present, you've got neat little flow charts visible on game tables, that sort of thing that enable players to really grok the rules quickly. Example turns are great. Deliberately designing your games so that the first turn has a bit lower stakes is great. ultimately having control, understand the rules on a more profound level, so that if a player is clearly trying to do X and they somehow haven't got how the mechanics intend for them to do X, that control can step in and make sure the result is the same. But yeah, and points that have been made in previous presentations, honestly, about ultimately if players have really shot themselves in the foot, it's not a bad thing for control to step in and dig them out. For the sake of the continuity of the game, I would say.
Well, that makes sense. Rose has a question. Do you think it's easier or harder to deal with the current environment of online mega games as opposed to games in physical space?
Great question. The answer is both yes and no. So the physical representation of information and the presentation of the game's state, I would say, is potentially much easier, and that's what online mega games, in my view, have to lean on, is compensating for. We all know that it's very, very hard to have as effective a discussion online, even one-on-one, let alone in groups, than it is in real life. I mean, if there's one thing the pandemic's taught us, it's definitely that. And therefore, that sort of person-to-person information gathering is inherently going to be harder, and that is what it is. And the way you compensate for that in an online mega game to still give players agency, meaningful decisions to make, I think has to be making the game state more accessible, more visible, having more screens up, more automatic reporting, all that sort of as a sort of counterbalance.
Yeah. I'm seeing that we're obviously a little bit over time, so I'm thinking unless there's going to be a riot, maybe just one more question and then I'll hand back over to Seamus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would like to answer Rob's very, very important question here. No, I think let's dig into Nick's question then about some aspects of the game being mechanically difficult.
Yeah.
My answer is fundamentally no. I'm aware that this is a universal view, but I would say, yeah, the nature of a mega game is that it is inherently there is room in the world for operational mega games, right, which are really just like 60-player war games or whatever. But the vast majority of mega games, the interest comes from the decisions that are taken in interaction with other players. If I'm just going off into a corner and essentially solving a mechanical puzzle by myself, that's not a boring experience. Some people quite enjoy that, but fundamentally that is not the different exciting thing that a mega game has to offer players. What makes a mega game, in my view, and obviously people are welcome to disagree, is the fact that my decisions cannot be taken in isolation. They have to be taken in interaction with other people, and the more that the mechanics are complex and present players with a puzzle that has to be solved in isolation, the less players are getting to make their decisions in reference to other players. And therefore, I think maybe in an ideal world you could have both, but I think this gets back to the point that I think it was Alex made in his presentation, that ultimately players won't achieve mastery of mega games, and that's not what mega games are about. And therefore, given the choice, I would say the challenge always has to come from the wider game state, the interaction with other players, the interaction with other areas of the game, rather than your area of the game having an interesting puzzle which you solve in a silo.
Thank you. Can I ask you one last question just before we finish up? Will you Zoom Rob this talk live every night as a lullaby?
I would be happy to, thrilled even.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ed. Seamus, are you about?
I am. Thank you, Holly. Well, gosh, you know what? I was hoping for 4 very interesting, very different, and very spicy presentations, and I think we've certainly had those, some fantastic stuff.